Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, wherever you are, whether it's your evening, your morning, or your afternoon. We're delighted to have you here with us. My name is Chương-Đài Võ. I am a researcher at Asia Art Archive. I'm delighted to welcome you to the second day of our symposium, Art Schools of Asia. This 6-day symposium culminates a monthly seminar that ran from last October to this May, with a cohort of 18 emerging scholars from around the world. The seminars took us across time and geography, from Shantiniketan in the early 20th century as a school for the arts with both local and international aspirations, to China and Tibet in the era of training in socialist realist painting, to Yogyakarta and Bandung, the sites of the first post-colonial schools in Indonesia, to Lahore, School of the Mayo School of Arts, which became the National College of the Arts in the new nation of Pakistan, to the Istanbul Academy of Fine Arts, where curricular reform coincided with the student movements of 1968, and to Hanoi, where the introduction of conceptual and performance-based practices was part and parcel of the Doi Mai, or renovation period in Vietnam. In revisiting these sites, the Art Schools of Asia program sought to highlight the often under-recognized role played by such sites of teaching and learning to the development of modern and contemporary art across the region and beyond, and to also decenter art history and scholarship away from the Euro-American paradigms. In other words, they explored the broader methodological and theoretical implications that thinking about schools and education have for the writing of art histories and institutions, and more broadly, from the perspectives of Asia. Over the next over the next 5 sessions, we had our first yesterday, the symposium will provide an opportunity for a larger public to take part in these discussions with the participants of the seminars and a number of invited guest speakers. Before I introduce our speakers, I would like to acknowledge the contribution of our peers at Asia Arts Archive. Susanna Chung, Oscar Ursoy, and Rebecca So in the Programs Department, Paul Furman, Karen Chung, and Chelsea Ma in Editorial, Crystal Lee, Ruby Weatherall, and Haley Wu in Development, Sally Lee, Chris Ho, Claire Sue, and Jane de Beauvoir, who understood the importance of the project. And to my colleagues on the research team, John Tain, Nupur Desai, Sneha Raghavan, Anthony Yoon, and Song Yang Shi. I would also like to express my gratitude to Leah Lam, who, as the cohort of Art Schools of Asia know full well, has been responsible for the administration of the project and keeping the seminar running as smoothly as it has been. Last but not least, we would like to thank the Getty Foundation and the Connecting Art Histories Initiative, especially Miguel de Baca, Anne Hamrick, and Joan Weinstein. Today, we will have 4 speakers. In the first half of our session, we will have a panel of 3 presentations. For our session, Schools Between Society and the State. The 3 cohort presentations will be followed by Q&A, and then a presentation by Amanda Rath, followed by a conversation. Before we begin the panel, I'd like to briefly introduce our speakers. You can find their full biographies on our program page. Our first speaker will be Dipti Sherchan. She is a PhD candidate in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Illinois in Chicago. Her research explores the relationship between artists, cultural institutions, and the nation state in Nepal. Our second speaker is Chabib Duta Hapsoro. He is a PhD student in the Department of Malay Studies at National University of Singapore. He received his MA from the Faculty of Arts and Design, Bandung Institute of Technology in 2014. Our third speaker will be Yuliya Sorokina. She received her doctorate from the Zurganov Kazakh National Academy of Arts in 2017. She is a senior lecturer. As a curator, she has organized projects for the Central Asia Pavilion at the 52nd Venice Biennial in 2007. And I will introduce our last speaker, Amanda Roth, in the second session of today's events. So with that, I'd like to invite Dipti to give our first talk.
Thank you so much, Chương-Đài. I hope everyone can see my slides. Okay. So good evening, morning, everyone. Today I'll be presenting a part of my ongoing dissertation research on how institution building relates to nation building. In order to understand this intricate relationship, I focus on the art institutions established during mid-20th century in Nepal, particularly under the patronage of the modern monarchs. I use the term modern here to emphasize the contradictory project of modernity undertaken by the monarchs at the wake of a broader decolonial movement, wherein they are firmly anchored as both Hindu sovereign bodies and modern political figures. In this presentation, I'll provide a brief historical context to help situate Nepal within the post-colonial discourse in South Asia, which obviously has a broader implication on understanding a history of modern art and art institution building in Nepal itself. Then I'll briefly talk about the first art school and swiftly move on to the main case study for today. Part of what I'm interested in is to also examine how the nationalization of the art school signals a shift in the political patronage, but unfortunately there might not be a lot of time to do that. Then I'll dedicate the rest of the presentation to shed some light on the individuals and artworks that are integral to understand the association and its role in the nation building project. Quote, first and most obviously, Nepal was never colonized. So it is not a post-colonial place. The lack of a colonial history is easily, unreflectively equated with lack of a history of national culture politics. I found this excerpt provocative in introducing Nepal to a wider audience here because it kind of brings up this question of, is it true that because Nepal was never directly colonized, that it is not a post-colonial place? What defines a post-colonial place? Can post-colonial encounters and exchanges still shape some of its conditions of non-coloniality? And secondly, as the author indicates, if the assumption, particularly in South Asian post-colonial studies, is that national cultural politics is in one way or another enmeshed with colonial histories, how can we understand Nepal's national cultural politics? Moving on to the historical context, which I'll attempt to synthesize in less than a minute or two, which is probably impossible. So inevitably, this is going to be not so comprehensive. But my aim here with presenting this timeline is to show how the 19th century Nepal and its rulers constantly encountered and interacted with the British Empire, be it through the Anglo-Gorkha War in 1814, during which the Gorkhali troops of Prithvi Narayan Shah had to secede territories in the west and east, or be it through Janga Bahadur Rana's Europe visit in 1850, during which he visited Britain and France and was very much enamored by the quote-unquote European aesthetics, or to the mercenary support that the Rana provided to the British to suppress the Indian Mutiny in 1857, I think, 1857, or its participation in both the world wars. The Ranas here belonged to a warrior nobility class and ruled over Nepal for more than a century. They had an ambivalent, for a lack of a better word here, relationship with the British Empire, as is very visible in this timeline. By early 20th century, anti-Rana sentiments became prominent. And after a few years of Indian independence in 1947, the Rana regime was also ousted, partly because of a coalition formed between Nepali political parties and King Tribhuvan. Obviously, the Ranas themselves had internal fractures and disputes and battles that also led to the weakening of their stronghold. However, this democratic fervor of the 50s was short-lived as King Mahendra dissolved the first elected government and imposed a direct rule. This period is known as the Panchayat regime, wherein many civil and political rights were curtailed and the monarch presided over the nation state. The Nepal Association of Fine Arts, which was established in 1964, um, um, needs to be contextualized within this period, under which it was established under the patronage of the then Crown Prince Birendra Shah. And the Panchayat's cultural politics very much shaped the institutional scope and limits of this association. Before I move to my main case study, I briefly wanted to mention the Juddha Kala Pathsala, an art school established by Juddha Samser Rana, one of the nobility class rulers, and he was the prime minister of Nepal between 1931 and 1945. So he established this school in early 1930s. The early cohort of art educators, like the headmasters and lecturers at the school, had received their own formal training in fine arts from art institutions such as Kolkata Government School of Art and JJ School of Fine Arts in Bombay. Going back to the notion of non-coloniality of Nepal then, this colonial art educational encounter, which continues to be quite an important regional as well as generational experience for artists, definitely not limited to Nepal, intimately connects Nepali art institutional history to the larger colonial and post-colonial conditions of modernity in South Asia, wherein modernist works is produced. Coming to the main case study here, I look at both the individuals affiliated with the association and artworks displayed in the institutional space of Nepal Association of Fine Arts to understand both the ideological and representational aspects of building a national institution. In this photo, you can see the executive members of the association. Prominently seated on the front row are King Mahendra, his son Crown Prince Birendra, and Mahendra's wife Queen Ratnaraja Lakshmi. Birendra himself was the executive chairperson, while the vice chairperson was Balkrishna Sama, who is at the back, who was a prominent Nepali dramatist and literary figure who famously gave up his surname Rana to dissociate himself with the nobility class. You can also see Loin Singh Bangdal on the other side, who is often also known as the quote-unquote father of modern art in Nepal, who was specially invited by King Mahendra to be part of the Royal Nepal Academy and oversee the development of Nepali art world. That's how the story goes. Most of the board members had received their art education from places like JJ School of Arts, MS University of Baroda, Shanti Niketan, and Kolkata Government School of Arts. Bangdal also trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Not to single them out, but the two women members in the middle in this photograph are Pramila Giri and Silu Pyari, who served as a treasurer and secretary, respectively. So while the rules and regulations of NAFA explicitly mentions its objective as, quote, to unite those persons who are engaged or interested in fine arts to act as a central agency for information in relations to fine arts, it also aimed to restore historic art. This distinction between fine arts and historic arts is indicative of Mahendra's project of nation building as tethered to both the nation's past, that is through the archaeological antiquities, and its present, that is through fine arts practiced by foreign educated modern artists. The figure of Birendra as an artist, art lover monarch is important to note here. His political legitimacy as the Hindu monarchical figure is obviously key to the association, but it is also the celebration of his artistic skills that somehow legitimates his position as the executive head of the art association. In this message, Birendra writes, quote, "Art should provide us not merely recreation, but also help propagate our culture and assist in the development of our country. It is high time, therefore, that every Nepali artist should contribute what he or she can to national construction in the spirit of considering the national interest as self-interest." Again, while examining the anatomy of the exhibition catalogs of this period, one can easily spot that the front pages are dedicated to the royal family members, and often these shows were put up during their birthdays. If we look at this particular catalog from 1969, the two broad categorization of art can be seen: traditional art and modern art. So the Nepal Association of Fine Arts also used to organize these annual national art exhibitions. What is interesting is, unlike the curriculum in the art school, which focused on medium specialization like either painting or sculpture, the recognition of artistic sort of merit here is made along the lines of traditional and modern art. So given the time constraints, I'll focus here on the category of modern art and show you some of the winning and participating artists and their artworks, which will help shed light on the fact that for the monarchs, these modern artworks were figuratively speaking, the building blocks of the modern nation of Nepal, and the artists were the builders of this nation. What I'd like to emphasize here is that while in some of the works, the symbolic representation is much more explicit and obvious, others pose questions about the agency of the artist itself as well, which probably I can't address fully here. So the first prize winner from the category of modern art is an abstract wooden sculpture that artist Govindanayan Japu salvaged from trash when he noticed that the branch seemed to resemble the very famous raised hand of King Tribhuvan, you can see on the right side, upon his return from India during the 1950s, right as Nepal became a democratic country. Titled Peace, it resonates again with one of the key rhetoric mobilized by both Mahendra and Virendra to represent Nepal in the global stage as a peaceful kingdom. Japu actually went to study in the Juda Kala Art School that I mentioned earlier, and eventually received a fellowship under the program of the Department of the United States for technical cooperation with our governments to study arts education in the University of Oregon in the US. Another participating artist, Thakur Prasad Mainali, his submission is called Construction, again, resonating with the message from Virendra about the need for Nepali artists to quite literally construct the nation, right? This particular submission seems to be a miniature, as you can see in the photo in the left, of an earlier public monumental sculpture by the same name, made by the same artist. The sculpture, according to the artist, represents various elements such as agriculture, health, education, peace and security, industry, transportation, irrigation, justice, culture, and the national flag is at the very top. The artist, who is an alumni of the MS University Baroda, also served as the secretary at the association. The second place in the modern art category was awarded to Jwala Saha. And if you look at the submission, it is a portrait of an older woman, nothing much going on there. What is interesting here is that Jwala Saha was the daughter of Balkrishna Sama, the vice chairperson that I mentioned earlier. And here you can see both of them in what appears to be some kind of a private art studio, where Jwala is surrounded by various art materials and Sama is seated in front of what seems to be a portraiture of King Tribhuvan, a work in progress. The specter of King Tribhuvan recurring in the artwork and the photograph conveys a sort of continuity, a genealogy of monarchs and their hegemonic presence in the institution building of this modern nation of Nepal. The third place is awarded to the submission Reclining Figure, a modern abstract sculpture by artist Pramila Giri, who incidentally served as the treasurer and also member of the association. Giri is an alumni of Shanti Niketan and considered as one of the prominent 20th century modernist artists in Nepal. Unlike the previously discussed winning works, this particular work does not necessarily convey an explicit sense of nation building. But I would like to mention here that Giri went on to create many public and monumental sculptures like Mainali, the previous artist, that represented similar themes of building the nation through various infrastructures such as education, health, and so on. Another submission during the 5th National Exhibition is by Loin Singh Bangdal, entitled Kathmandu. Kathmandu is the capital city of Nepal. Bangdal belonged to the diasporic Nepali-speaking community in Darjeeling, who later went on to study in Calcutta and Paris, where he eventually was scouted by King Mahendra to come to Nepal. Interestingly, Bangdal had never been to Nepal before 1960s, and yet with regards to view about art, he writes, quote, "My paintings have directly been influenced by the mountains and the temples of Nepal. I look at things as they emerge, and slowly the inner eye reveals another kind of form and image, and I discover its inner spirit." This spirit again resonates with Birendra's message earlier. Finally, one can recognize Ramananda Joshi's The Stream of Life in Spite of Famine and War in the backdrop of this photograph on the left with the winning sculpture that I began this presentation with. Joshi was an alumni of JJ School of Arts and also served as the member of the association. In the book, Shrestha writes, this is a book you can see at the very end, artist is about the artist himself. The author writes, quote, once he, Joshi, expressed his intense feeling of traveling the various parts of the country for painting to the king, who graciously accepted his creative attitude and generously granted the travel fund, quote ends. What I'm trying to arrive at here is this almost intimately accessible relationship between the artist and the art lover monarch and their shared constructive spirit in doing something for the nation. The national culture of politics, that is the building of the National Art Association for the, quote, development of a national art and culture, takes on the visual register of modern art. That is a product of colonial and post-colonial modernisms in South Asia. Going back to the earlier posed question of what is the implication of such a politics in the absence of a colonial history, here I tease out, at least through seeking art education in Indian art institutions from the colonial period or in the metropole such as Paris, how perhaps there are different ways in which one can think of colonial histories and post-colonial encounters that happen via art education and art world encounters. Often these regional relationships are not taken into consideration while thinking about post-colonial modernisms or projects of modernities. And in my work, I'm sort of interested to explore that further. So thank you so much for listening to me. And again, at the very end, I'd like to thank Asia Art Archive and especially Chương-Đài, who helped me sort of give me very constructive feedback. And I'm looking forward to listening to other presenters today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dipti, for that fascinating talk. I'll look forward to discussing more with you during the Q&A. But right now, I'd like to invite Chabib to give the second talk.
Okay, thank you everyone for coming to this second day of presentation symposium, and thank you firstly for Asia Art Archive that already organizing this amazing event, hosting all of us since 6 months ago. And my presentation is about my ongoing doctoral research, which deals with the artistic production of and the existence of Decenta group, which for me, I think dominate in the early 70s to early 80s, in the early period of New Order administration under President Suharto. His administration has been well known in not only repressive, but also suppressing leftist political and cultural power. And one of the administration objectives is to prevent any dissenting political expressions, to accelerate economic development under state-driven economy, as well as to control state institution and resources under cronyism and army interests. So to secure this need or interest, then it requires to depoliticize the people. In regards of the depoliticization in the New Order cultural sphere, my presentation will be organized under this structure. First is the domination of identity and aesthetics in Indonesian art discourse in the New Order period. And at the same time is the exclusion of emancipative ideas in this period as well. Also, the second, Decenta as an enterprise, including their commission art practice under New Order depoliticized patron-client cultural policy. And the third is the effect of Decenta's enterprise on Indonesian art education, especially for Bandung Institute of Technology, ITB. Let me tell you about Decenta. First, Decenta was a design firm actually. It was founded by Adrian Palar, Gregorius Siddhartha, and Abdul Jalil Pirus. The three are graduate of Fine Art Department, Bandung Institute of Technology, ITB, the first modern art school in Indonesia, founded in 1947 by Simon Admiral and Ries Mulder. Both are Dutch artists who were in Bandung in Indonesian Revolution period. At the time, Bandung still belonged under Dutch administration in the critical period of revolution. They established modernist art education, which the outputs are not interested in realistic representation, but very much explore form, colors, texture. Back to the three graduates, they need to make kind of legalized company to take an offer a commission project in a big building, conical building in the central in Jakarta in 1973. Previously, Adrian Palar already worked at Proplat, an army-owned construction company. Soon they invited Sunario, Tesutanto, and then Priyanto Sunarto to get involved in the group. After finishing the project, they declared their name as Decenta, which is an abbreviation from Design Center Association. The next slide, the domination of identity quest and aesthetic and formalism in Indonesian art making and discourse in the New Order were mostly caused by the absence of art and cultural organization which flourished under liberal and guided democracy under Sukarno presidency. Previously, in the first years of independence, Indonesia had Sanggars, a community-based art school which deliver also political aspiration like leftist and anti-colonial. There are, for example, like Seniman Indonesia Muda or Sanggar Pelukis Rakyat. In the next period, Indonesia had some cultural organizations which were affiliated with political parties such as Lekra, Institute of People Cultures, which affiliated with Communist Party, and then Les Bumi, Institute of Indonesian Muslim Artists and Cultural Practitioners, which affiliated with Islamic mass organization of Nahdlatul Ulama. And then the third is LKN, Institute of National Culture, affiliated with National Party of Indonesia. So based
Chabib,
on,
can I ask you to share full screen? Because right now we just see all of the slides.
oh, sorry.
Thank you. Perfect.
Oh, okay, sorry. So by Supangkat's elaboration, we then can understand because there was no political art organization, the art school then gained more influences than the previous political period. The schools like ITB, Bandung School, and Indonesian Art Institute of Yogyakarta, ISI, as a Jogja school, since they are state-run art bodies, they must implement any direct instruction from the state. Within the politicized cultural sphere, there was no chances for this art school to deliver any obvious ideology or political aspiration, especially the dissenting ones. Then we can make a comparison. In the previous political period, arguably the arts organization deal with ideology and the motives of accumulating resources. We can also argue that under the new order, the art schools required new approaches in collecting resources. So we then can continue to argue that the approach of formalism and identity were the best deal for the art academies in accumulating resources under the direct patronage of the New Order state. The two approaches not only beneficial for the state since they are politically neutral, but also for the art school themselves. In the next slide, I will show how the mutual relationship emerged between the state and the art school in the form of patronage. So the image shows on how the patronage occurred firstly in the relation of state and the art school. The state commissioned ITB Art Department to design Indonesian Pavilion in Expo 70 in Osaka. This kind of relationship illustrates how the New Order state implementing cultural policy. The arts funding was not distributed to the state art bodies as the state obligation or service to the public to develop culture. Instead, merely under the state motives, patron-client policy to propagandize national identity. This kind of patron-client cultural policy only distribute arts funding to exclusive circle of elites. To give another context, in the half of decade of the 70s, Indonesian economic experienced significant growth for oil boom, and then creating a new middle class that demand art object, as in painting, sculpture, and design, as explained here by Sanento Yuliman. And back to the art school, this kind of relationship made the art school benefited a lot in terms of accumulating symbolic, cultural, and economic capital. I see that as the art academy as form of enterprise, which doing very efficient business. For example, in the investment of manpower in design and architecture. The state also put further trust to the artists who belongs to the art academy as lecturers to organize art exhibition under state sponsor. I also think that this kind of relationship made the artists which were affiliated with the art school in Indonesia had more chances to earn their living wealthier than the artists who didn't affiliate with the art school. So these are some examples of Decenta's commission works in the form of aesthetic element which ordered by or commissioned by the state institution or state-owned companies. Decenta not only tackled commission works in Jakarta, but also in the big cities in Java and other cities in surrounding island. They also deal with private sectors that demand artistic and aesthetic elements and design products. Decenta responded to commission art practice and expanded existing mutual relationship with the state to another level. Comparing with other artist lectures in ITB, Decenta were more aware to expand their strategy to accumulate bigger capital. For instance, after getting some big money, they established an art gallery in Bandung in 1978, which have more flexibility in networking. Not only networking more with corporate sectors, they also could establish an international network. This network had not previously initiated outside state government support. By this network, they could exhibit their works, especially in their silk screen works in some international significant printmaking biennales. This kind of enterprise were also fruitful for their career, especially in providing production costs for artwork making. They also could access quite advanced photography and design technology at the time, not only for their design works, but also printmaking works. In addition, to support their art reception and publishing, so they can publish their own book or own exhibition catalog, which at that time was hardly afforded by other artists in their generation. So in Decenta, its prominent members had a multitask role, like not only artists. They can be designer, curator, manager, dealer, and project director, and many more. So it is some points that we can pay attention for the presentation so far that make a reason on how and why Decenta thrived under New Order. So we can underline like the differences between Sukarno presidency and the New Order in patronizing artists. The second is Bandung School as the producer of apolitical art, and the state needed them for its ideological apparatus. The third is corporate sector was very dominant, and the boom of decorative painting. Since the personal works of Decenta members also incorporating decorative elements, they also enjoyed the boom. The fourth is cultural resources as inspiration to pursue pragmatic ends to support pembangunan or development, and the function of cultural policy in creating an obedient and submissive mass. So to assume some effects of Decenta towards art education, or especially in ITB, we can trace a bit what Decenta had been done. Decenta existed when the design discipline and its industry is in the initial part or very start of growth in Indonesia in the 70s. Besides, the state puts trust on Decenta and ITB for managing and undertaking commission project since there was almost no other institution who could take the responsibility at the time. As Decenta got experience in real situation, then they could formulate them as a relevant teaching materials in ITB, both in art or in design. By that, I can argue that Decenta contribute to art education, especially in ITB, to have more focus on to fulfill more demand in industry and market. I see we also Yudo Seputro's statement as his reflection to the objective of higher art education in the new order. The development of art education at the time was to carry out the needs of development. Finally, we have arrived at the end of my presentation. So by my elaboration, I want to argue that first, Decenta's role was dominant through its ability in securing crucial posts to accumulate capitals by art school, art galleries, art market, and state administration. Decenta was an enterprise which dominated both state and private sectors. And then the Decenta domination somehow contributed to the unpopularity of emancipative and critical ideas in Indonesian art during the New Order. Second, ITB as an art school as a place in producing elites, as well as to accumulate capital and reproduce cultural elites. In the New Order era, the cultural elite reproduction was meaningful for maintaining stability, especially in the context of capital circulation and accumulation. So that's all for my presentation. Thank you very much. And thank you, Chương-Đài, for your moderation.
Thank you very much, Chabib, for that presentation. And I'd like to invite Yuliya to give us the last presentation, and then we'll have a Q&A with all three panelists. Yuliya?
Yeah. So I would like to a little bit remind me who I am. My name is Yuliya Sorokina. I am independent curator and tutor in Jurgenev Kazakh National Academy of Arts as well, and also in independent school for young people. I'm working usually in Almaty, Kazakhstan, and you can find here my email and website if you are going to learn more about it. So I'm in a very tricky situation because I have a hard task on today. I am responsible here for quite a big region, which we call Central Asia. And you can see here the map of this big region. And I am focused today, of course, on post-Soviet Central Asia, which includes 5 countries, actually: Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan. So all these kinds of stans. They all gained independence after the collapse of the USSR in 1991. And that's why we call them post-Soviet countries, independent national countries of Central Asia. Looking on this map, you can see that there are quite different landscapes in this area. And of course, it's a different climate, which is not really very comfortable always. But you cannot see through this map that there are many different people and nations living here. And they are living in a strange, let's say, different time, like using a kind of time machine. And of course, they all have different socio-cultural paradigms. And I argue that Central Asia is a very conditional geopolitical generalization. Here I show you a very famous poster of one of the most popular movies of Soviet period. It's called White Sun of the Desert. And you see here on this poster a lot of cliches about so-called Miracle East of Central Asia. And you can see here women which covered by paranja. And you can see here men on the horses. It's so-called basmachi, or kind of bandits who fighting with the Soviet army against this revolutionary ideas. And the only one or two or a few very good guys from Russian Red Army, they bring kind of sunrise to this dark life in the East. And of course, today I will focus on a few issues because it's impossible to overview such a big region from the very beginning until nowadays. That's why I am focusing on the following issues. I will show you a couple of examples of national masterpieces and masters of traditional and religious art before the Soviet period. Of course, I will talk a little bit about the influence of so-called Soviet modernism to the Soviet school and socialist realism to the national art. And we will touch a bit the issue of the fall of the Iron Curtain and the influence of postmodernism and modernistic ideas to the local art scene. And last but not least, we will try to see the search for identity in new independent countries of post-Soviet Asia. Here you can see, by the way, very good done and in a way famous images of the unique photographer Sergei Prokudin-Gorsky, who traveled through the so-called Turkestan. It was the title of Central Asia in the beginning of 20th century. So he traveled through Turkestan and made color photos in that time in 1907. Can you imagine? And here you see the photos of two kinds of population in so-called Turkestan. So on the left side, you see a nomad population and a nomad woman, young nomad woman, I can tell girl even. She is standing near the typical nomad house. We usually call it yurt. And this house you can replace quite easily. And of course, it's very useful for nomadic population. And you see here kind of examples of handcrafting, such as Turkmen carpet on the ground and a very colorful dress on the lady, on this young girl. And you can imagine that people and craftsmen of nomadic population, they of course making a wonderful handcrafting pieces, but all of them, they were very useful and it was not so-called fine art. So another image on the right show us a piece of life in Bukhara. And it's actually a part of the palace in Bukhara of Emir of Bukhara. And here you can see the soldier, a guard at the Emir Palace in Bukhara. And you can see that in the cities, in the settlements, and was population which never wandering as nomads, but they build in beautiful miracle places, cities, and agricultural land, and agriculture, cotton and silk, and making extraordinary beautiful masterpieces of decorative art and architecture, actually. So in between these two levels or two kind of population we start our journey to the art and art education in Central Asia. Now I can talk a little bit about the first professional artist who came to Central Asia by himself in 1850 or in 18 at the end, actually at the end of 19th century, and he stayed in Almaty, which in that time was called Verny, all his life mostly, and he worked as a draftsman in the beginning, and then he started to work as a drawing teacher, as a teacher of painting and drawing in gymnasiums of Verny city. And actually, this artist considered as a first professional art teacher in the region. His name is Nikolai Khludov. And you see his photo on the left side. And on the right side, you see an examples of his painting and drawing, which he made mostly traveling through the Kazakhstan or Central Asia and collecting a lot of stories about the life of local people, their traditions, etc., etc. But he also making such an efforts to establish so-called fine art in the region, and actually he is a teacher of first professional artists in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan at least. And here you see those first artists who started the development of fine art in the region. On the left side, you see Abelhan Kosteyev work, which called Turksib. So Turksib, it's the first long railway through the all Eurasia mostly, and you see here the picture which shows how people was happy to see this new life and this new order, the Soviet sunrise, etc., etc. And of course, you see that the artist, he actually trusts to this idea of Soviet sunrise, and of course he was very truthful in his paintings, and they even looks like a bit naive, but he was very good person, and in the memories of his friends and just people of that time, we see that he making a lot for development of art scene of Kazakhstan at least. And on the right side, you see the work by Semyon Chuykov, the daughter of Soviet Kyrgyzstan. Semyon Chuykov considered as the first professional artist in Kyrgyzstan and person who actually established the fine art in Kyrgyzstan. And you see that it's absolutely, you are sure that it's socialist realism as itself. And of course, you see the influence of the ideas of social realism in both masterpieces, of course. Actually, the Soviet modernistic project changed the way of life and everyday culture of the peoples in Central Asia. And it was not only the changing of the life, but it was also the changing of their paradigms and the changing of people perception of the life. And of course, the strong influence we got from Stalin's Red Terror, which systematically destroyed the progressive intelligentsia, turning Central Asia into the territory of concentration camps for cultural workers. Maybe you know that on the territory of Kazakhstan, for instance, we have a lot of so-called labor camps where during Stalin time, a lot of really high intelligence were replaced by force. and some of them even died there, and some of them just spent a part of their life in Kazakhstan because they were not allowed to go to so-called central cities as Moscow or Leningrad. And because of that, finally, we have a lot of influence of really good art and really good artistic ideas in the region. And it became even stronger during World War II, when Almaty and Tashkent became the capitals of the evacuated cultural infrastructure. We had in Almaty Mosfilm, Lenfilm, we had the main theaters from Moscow. In Tashkent, they also have a lot of really good artists evacuated, and some scientific institutes, etc., etc. So a lot of artists from Russia, Ukraine, Baltic states, etc., worked in Central Asia, whereas a young Asian artist went to study in Moscow and Leningrad in art academies. And on the picture, you see an example of so-called Stalin's Empire style. It's our Academy of Science in Almaty, and it was done by famous Russian architect Alexei Shusev. So here I get you an example of two very important figures for Kazakhstani contemporary art, because Sergei Kalmykov and Vladimir Sterligov, they were people whom we can call the last vanguard artists. And Sergei Kalmykov was a student by Petrov Vodkin, and Vladimir Sterligov was a student of Kazimir Malevich. So both have their own ideas and their own universe of art system. For instance, Kalmykov, he was a kind of cavalier of the world, and he developed very science fictional pictures, as you see here, and still is very important artist for Kazakhstani people. And Vladimir Sterligov, he had his own ball couple drawing system, and you can see here how it works in his masterpiece. Both living for a while in Almaty. Sergei Kalmykov living all his life in Almaty, and Vladimir Sterligov was a prisoner in the camp and then also lived for a while in Almaty and working with the students there. Another example, which is very important for Central Asian art, is an influence of Sovietsky Museum for Vanguard and traditional Karakalpak art in Nukus in Uzbekistan. And of course, this collection and the efforts which made Sovietsky by himself for collecting and saving all these masterpieces of vanguards, it makes a very strong influence to the art of nowadays. And here you see quite a famous names. On the left side, Alexander Nikolaev, so-called Ustomumin, his nickname was Ustomumin, who used, you see, and ideas of modern and connect them with the traditions of Persian miniatures and making his own style. And Alexander Volkov, who was also a very famous vanguard artist and lived most part of his life in Uzbekistan as well. So both all these figures, they of course make a strong influence because they all teaching. They teaching like let's say hand to hand, and they keep a lot of followers to whom they hand over the heritage of vanguard and the traditions of vanguard, Russian vanguard and international modernism. And here you see Salihuddin Aitbayev piece. Salihuddin is a Kazakh artist, and he is a bright representative of this follower. So we also can talk about Rustam Halfin, Kazakh artist, and Vyacheslav Akhunov, Uzbek artist, who also got this heritage and got this influence from avant-garde artists. Now we are going to the academic of Central Asian fine art, and here you see that in the end of 20th century, a lot of academies were opened in the main cities of Central Asia. For instance, you can see here Kazakh National Academy of Arts, where I'm working actually, and Central Exhibition Hall of the Academy of Arts of Uzbekistan in Tashkent. And both are the masterpieces of modernism, but both now working in a very archaic way, sovereign in a way the governmental strategy of propaganda and of very strange way of looking for identity in official modus. Here I show you interiors of Turgenev Academy of Art, and you can see that it's quite semi-official and outdated academic spirit here. But meanwhile, a lot of alternative movements and groups continue the traditions of avant-garde and their schools, and try to turn the education for art to the other direction, to the very free and national and international so-called global direction. And see here Green Triangle Group and Kizil Tractor Group, both made a lot for educating young people, and a lot of famous artists who are working today come up from there. And finally, of course, all these movements and all these efforts, they get chance to young artists nowadays to arise and to work in the international context. And you can see here two examples. On the left side, the School of Artistic Gesture, it's an education program for young artists in Almaty, Kazakhstan, and Creative Group 705 in Bishkek, who mostly working in performance modus, and they are working in Bishkek, but both are working in Central Asian region as well. So, as a summary, I can argue that art education appeared in Central Asia as a professional system at the turn of 19th and 20th centuries, brought here by enthusiastic travelers. The Soviet modernistic project formalized the framework of an education system based on the academic school and the principles of socialist realism. In parallel with the repression of avant-garde cultural figures, an alternative culture of artistic resistance developed anyway. And the fall of the Iron Curtain during Perestroika and the search for identity made it possible to perceive the advanced ideas of modernism and form its local version of local modernism, so-called local modernity. And of course, the subversive strategies of the leaders of the art process still have a decisive influence on the development of the art scene in Central Asia. And as natural nomads, the artists of Central Asia are free in their movement, in the flow of time and the artistic paradigms. And on the right side, I show you at the end the piece by Sergei Maslov, who was himself also a brilliant teacher and a very good artist. And he worked a lot for forming the atmosphere of independence and playful universe for Central Asian artists. And he had the novel which called Astral Nomads. That's why I use this title for the memory of him. And you can visit our site where you can see a little bit more about the issues which I'm told you today. Thank you very much. That's all for today. And of course, I would like to say to express my love and that I am very thankful to the whole team of Asia Art Archive for organizing such a brilliant seminar. I don't mean only today, but I also mean this 6 months. And I am really learning a lot about schools of Asia, art schools of Asia, and I'm very happy to be part of it with my Central Asian colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Yuliya, for your presentation. And the team at Asia Art Archive has also felt really privileged to be able to be in conversation with you and the rest of the cohort during the last 8 months. While we wait for questions from the audience, I'd like to begin the Q&A session with a question for each of our speakers. So Dipti, Sherchan, you focused on the National Association of Fine Arts in Nepal and their categorization of modern and contemporary art and what they call historic art. You looked at the specter of the monarchy and the institutions of nation building. And I'm interested in whether you can speak a little bit more about what the implications were for arts education through these distinctions of the modern, the contemporary, and the historic. Because in each context, these terms don't have neutral definitions, they're not given. So I'd like to ask if you can elaborate a little bit more how those terms were defined within a context that, as you mentioned, was not a post-colonial context, but the context of monarchy and nation building. Chabib, Duta, Hapsoro, you talked about Decenta and the relationship of the group of artists and the New Order government. You talked about how the implications of the work of Decenta brought an emphasis on arts industry and the market into the curriculum at the Institute of Technology Bandung's art faculty. I'd like to ask if you can tell us a bit more about how artists outside of Decenta responded to the group's work. Right? So was it seen as something that was a conservative move? Was it seen as something that was an important critical intervention? What was the response to the influence of Decenta, not only on the curriculum at ITB, but also on the arts ecology in Bandung? And by extension, I'd like to ask if you can also help us think about what were the responses from some of the other art centers on the island Java. So namely, in this case, it would be Jogja and Jakarta. Yuliya, Sorokina, you focused on Central Asia and the ushering in of Soviet socialist realism in the region. You gave us an overview of the contrast between what happened politically as exemplified by Stalin's Red Terror campaign, but also the optimism of socialist realism as seen in depictions of the idyllic or the pastoral or the naive. So I'd like to ask if you can help us understand how did artists in Central Asia, or specifically in Kazakhstan, negotiate the nomadic cultures of craft making and I say craft making in italicized, right, because that itself is a particular construction. How did they negotiate that tradition or those cultures and the imposition of Soviet socialist realism? Dipti, can I ask you to begin?
Oh, sorry, thank you so much for that question. And I'm not sure if I can adequately respond to that, but I will try. So with regards to the use of the word historic art, and I think the phrase itself is to restore historic art. So there is an implication that something was lost, like the historic art was lost or hasn't is in a state that requires it to be restored, which I'm making an informed guess as sort of also implying the period before the monarchy, the nobility class, oligarchic regime as being this dark age during which a lot of these historic works were not taken care of, right? So I think the monarch is also posing itself as the guardian of these sort of quote unquote historic art. And what I can tell from what Mahendra was doing was he had established the Department of Archaeology, and he was doing a lot of like excavation projects. He was commissioning a lot of those in the early, late 50s and early 60s. And part of that project is also when Loinsing Bangdel, who is again, his practice is abstract expressionism or abstract modern art, but what he ends up doing as part of the Royal Nepal Academy is creating this inventory of the stone sculptures in the Kathmandu Valley. And so the valley is sort of native to an indigenous or ethnic group called Newar, and a lot of the Loinsing Bangdel, who is an artist, ends up also being this DIY art historian who goes around sort of archiving and collecting and sort of taking photographs and making very meticulous records of all these works, right? So I think there is sort of this, I'm not sure how much of that seeps into the actual art education curriculum in the college. However, outside of the art school, there is an interest through the Department of Archaeology and the Royal Nepal Academy to sort of quote unquote restore historic art, which basically represents antiquities, right? From the medieval period, and so there's and then interestingly enough, in the 1960s is when also these stone, bronze, wooden sculptures start to travel to places like the US in various universities as part of these sort of traveling exhibitions at various university museums. So, in an interesting way, they enter the circuit of art education in the US, where it fills into this sort of art history survey course as representing art from Far East Asia at that point in the 60s, right? So that's like sort of an interesting way to think about what restoring historic art meant for the monarch, right? It was not necessarily only a national project, but it was also like an international project of displaying a certain kind of tradition, but at the same time, modern sensibilities of displaying this quote unquote tradition, right? When it comes to like a category of modern and contemporary, as many of you probably can also guess, there are a lot of slippages in how those terms are used. What I can see from the sort of catalogs from the annual national exhibitions is the word modern is quite immediately let go of, and contemporary becomes a more popular term to refer to all the works that are not traditional, right? And they sort of and obviously so much can be said about what that means, but again, going back to the implication on art education, because again, I wasn't really looking in art educational curriculums, especially in the college. However, whoever, like all the teachers, masters, and lecturers that enter the art educational circuit are all coming with education from India, Pakistan, and some of them were also studying in Russia. So they all bring in their own sort of set of sort of understanding of what modern means. So it's kind of difficult to exactly tease out how it plays in the classroom, but the classroom environment, from what I can tell from interviews with people, is is a very standard sort of formal art education environment. You sort of start from thinking about like drawing and lines and shadows, and so there is sort of getting that skills, and so it's sort of difficult for me to speak directly to what the implication of thinking about modern and contemporary is in the art education itself. So I think, I don't know if that addressed your question, but I guess overall, like all of this, however, needs to be contextualized within the cultural politics of Panchayat period. So the Panchayat period, in terms of the monarch, is sort of, the monarch is the sort of incommensurate figure, because the monarch is sort of, it's an authoritarian regime for all intents and purposes, but it's also taking up the project of modernity for the nation, right? So it also needs to be democratic, but at the same time it's imposing sort of direct rule, and so there's this interesting sort of tension. And for the monarch, the sort of national culture during this period is about promoting a certain kind of Hindu sort of elite male sort of subjectivity, and that is done through especially if you look at education generally and not just art education, you can see that there is an emphasis on a certain kind of language, which is Nepali. There's a certain emphasis on understanding culture, which is like Hindu, Brahmin, sort of upper caste, right? So those sort of implications, I'm not sure how they translate to then thinking about art education, but I'm sure they were in play if one were to look into that in the campuses. Yeah.
Thank you, Dipti. That was very helpful. I find it interesting that you talked about how archaeological digs and exhibitions were used to define what the historic was. Yeah, and that definition was necessary as a way to understand what the modern and the contemporary was. Can you help us understand a little bit more how, or were the distinctions made between modern art and contemporary art? I noticed in one of the catalog pages that you showed us in the award section that there was a category for modern art that was in bold, and then halfway down there's a category for contemporary art. Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering, what was the difference between the two in terms of the works that you saw?
From what I can tell, the use of modern and contemporary also signals a certain kind of generation of cohort that was entering into the art scene in Nepal. So the early sort of cohort in the 60s and like late 60s and 70s, who particularly were coming from like art education background from like JJ School of Art, or had gone to Paris and sort of, or even Baroda and all these places, they were their work is often referred to as modern art, and especially like particularly looking at Loin Singh Bangdal's work, who studied in Calcutta government and then School of Art, and then went to London and Paris. And so there is this sort of cohort of early 70s and sort of late 70s artists whose work is often looked at as modern, but interesting enough, the word modern is sometimes synonymously used as abstract as well. So maybe that's something to make note of. Contemporary is then, even though like one can see that it is popularly used in the catalogs, but it seems to refer to a later generation of artists who follow suit to these sort of quote unquote pioneers who've gone and studied abroad. So the modern and contemporary signal, at least in this case, a more generational sort of group of people, from what I can tell. I'm sure there are many other ways to think about it, but that's what comes to my mind right now.
Thank you very much, Dipti. Chabib, can I ask you to talk a bit about Decenta and the reactions of artists outside of the group?
Okay, so the first is the reaction maybe in the first the outer circle. Then they are an artist that on ITB but not part of Decenta. Obviously they are envy because they are not as wealthier than Decenta. I want to say that there is a kind of competition, but not competition in ideology, but competition in getting resources, somehow like that. And maybe I would say there is a kind of dissenting views or dissenting opinion or dissenting aspiration from the younger generation in ITB, like in the 70s, like Jim Supangkat, that he creates a Indonesian art movement somehow. The idea of expanding art medium is not kind of so as an alternative of decorative painting, somehow like that. And also the younger generation than Jim Supangkat in the late 80s, like Samsar Siaan, Arah Mayani, and Tisna Sanjaya, that they have a kind of more various also critical art expression, but somehow it's not get such a lot of appreciation in the local in Bandung or in Indonesia, and then they try to search some opportunity from international networks. So that's why yeah, because there is the depoliticization still remains until 80s, so they have to find another way to promote and show and get a good living from the art. So the way to do this is to find external sources from international networks. Yeah, I would say like that. And also the situation outside Bandung, like Jogja or Jakarta. Yeah, I think it's the same, because the depoliticization is in cultural sphere, like will remain massive, yeah, in all of part of Indonesia. Like for example, the issue of identity is very much happening in Jogja, because a lot of artists like somehow keen to incorporating like batiks, visual to their paintings or their artworks, somehow like that. And then in Jakarta, even because Bandung school and ATB also prominent in creating such kind of art bureaucrats, somehow like that, because some lecturer from ITB, they get a lot of opportunity in, like Bud Mohtar is an artist from ITB, is also a rector of Indonesian in Jogja school in the 80s as well. And a lot of Bandung ITB lecturers also were lecturers in Institut Kesenian Jakarta Art Institute as well, like Gregory Siddhartha, and then Ade Pirus, Sunario, Tesutanto. They were also a lecturer in Jakarta Art Institute. So the situation is the same, yeah, Bandung, Jakarta, and Jogja.
Can you say a little bit more about the new order and why, you know, a group like Decenta would have flourished within that context? Right? Because you mentioned how one of the reactions against Decenta was the new art movement, you know, which was a group of artists who rejected the use of art for decorative purposes and felt that it was very apolitical. And so they injected a more progressive political stance into their work. So can you help us understand that a little bit more in terms of the importance of Decenta and why a group like that, would have been so prominent during the New Order, and then why a later generation of artists, were very critical of them, as seen in the New Art movement?
Yeah, because I see that the Decenta is very massive, the influence. Like, if we say that in gerakan, Indonesian New Art movement is, I think, is more prominent in this course than Decenta right now. Like, lots of scholars, local or international, must discuss Indonesian art movement more than Decenta, because it's more, I think it's more enticing lah for this kind of situation, more enticing topic, because the critical one is maybe more enticing for the scholars. But I think, the Decenta influence is because a lot of big collectors must collect Decenta's works somehow in the local market, in the local private sector. The works of Decenta is more marketable than the Indonesian art movement. But I see also, maybe I will add something, the one that most critical one to Decenta is Sherchan, due to his performance to burn Sunaryo's works that incorporated Papua motifs, somehow like that. The act of burn of Sherchan is to criticize Sunaryo as a Decenta's member, that only doing kind of cultural appropriation to the primitive arts. Yeah, I see like that.
So the work that you're referring to is Sherchan burning a work of
Sunaryo, his teacher.
Right.
Yeah,
and so that was a really radical and seen as an like just really crossing the line.
Yeah.
And he burned that work on the campus of ITB, the school where he studied. Right?
Yeah, and the consequences, he get dropped out from ITB. Yeah.
Can you say a little bit more about how artists in Jakarta and Jogja responded to the work of Decenta, right? Especially, given the historic rivalry between Jogja and Bandung, where Bandung was seen more as affiliated with the Dutch colonial history, and Jogja was seen as a seat of revolution. So, because you talked about how there was a competition for resources, right? And that was one of the responses among artists. But was it the critical response? Was it more vocal outside of Bandung, or would you say that you didn't? What were your observations?
So my observation is there is no like critical voice from Jogja to Bandung, because they are like quite overwhelmed with the situation in the locals, because like I think Indonesian art movement is quite responsive for Jogja art situation. They're very famous or very keen to do kind of decorative art expression, so they are quite bored. And then also the repression of the young artists like FX Arsono, they're doing kind of avant-garde expression, so the school quite disturbed, and then get them expelled from the school as well. So there is no response between respond like Jogja respond to Bandung, or Jakarta respond to Bandung. There is nothing like that. Yeah, I found like that.
Thank you, Chabib.
Yeah, thank you.
Yuliya, can I ask you to respond to the question of how artists negotiated the nomadic cultures and then the imposition of Soviet socialist realism?
Well, thank you for the question, because it's a very, for me, it's a very important question. On the one hand side, I actually in a way hate social realism, to be honest, because it's repressed the freedom, etc. And it's reduced the perception of art among people, and it should be very easy understandable, easy eating, and promote some propaganda ideas. And it brings, of course, a lot of cliches in the art, because artists very easy trained to just to draw very realistically what's going on. But on the other hand, it's like, in nomadic tradition, we have these songers, which poets, songers, who create their songs just now. So they singing song about what they're looking around. So it's like kind of storytelling, poetically storytelling. And I think in a way, this fine art of nomadic part especially, it looks like the storytelling. So horses, yurts, mountains, people celebrating, people walking, people do this, people do that, something like that. So they just explain the easy life. It's one point, and another point. It's also interesting how they use, I mean, both sides, government and these propaganda forces, and people and artists, how they use this tricky game with this the main postulate of social realism, that art should be national in form and socialist in content. So I would like to show you the example how the decorative art just make it easily. I just want to visualize you this thing. So look, it's a carpet. So you can see how they work with the carpet. Look, it's not a drawing, it's a carpet, and this is a carpet too. So they just kind of replace these sacral symbols which they usually put on the carpets, and put their socialistic sacral symbols, just change it. But because of that, now artists of contemporary art, they easily use this subversive character of art, and they again play this game on a very high level. They use national traditional art for international language of contemporary art. And for instance, Dilia Kaipova, who working with a traditional textile, which we call ikat. Of course, about this textile technique. So she put on the chapans, on this dresses, and other symbols. She put, for instance, on traditional ikat, Mickey Mouse or Darth Vader, or the symbol of a nuclear weapon or whatever. So I think that social realism plays the role of the teacher as well in this sense. So social realism in a way teach artists how to play with this modernistic game, being national but also international, and it helps to create this local modernity which I'm talking about, if it makes sense.
Thank you, Yuliya. We have a couple of questions for the audience that I'd like to read to our panelists. This is a question for Yuliya. Most of the earlier artists that you discussed have Russian names. Into the slide on Sorokina above, and they painted images of local people in an ethnographic mode. Were they sent there as Soviet cultural workers? What was the role of Russian experts in Soviet Central Asian art institutions? And when and how did non-Russian Central Asian artists, such as Atdev, come into key roles in the institutions. So Yuliya, if you can just take a few minutes to think about that, I'll read another question, and this is for all three of our speakers. All three speakers position the school among a range of art collective organizations and associations, both formal and informal, but Chabib in his presentation suggests that the school may be distinguished through its function in terms not of the acquisition of skills, but in the transfer of cultural capital. Can Dipti and Yuliya comment on how that dynamic might play out in the context that we're researching? So in Dipti's case, the Nepali monarchy, and in Yuliya's case, the Soviet Kazakh state. So Yuliya, can I ask you to respond to the first set of questions?
Yeah, as for Russian influence, of course, it's again a very complicated and hot question, of course, in our state. And as you see, me myself, I looks like in European way, in a way, but I'm not Russian, but anyway. Most of so-called Asian Russians, we use this term, came to Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and other countries not by their own will, you know, and it was a kind of this red terror which replaced people, replaced nations. So you was not so free in going here and there. And of course, it was a kind of repression moment from Russian Empire in a way. But on the other hand, it was a kind of breach to European civilization as well. And I mean, and it was breach for Europeans to come to Central Asia. It was a kind of this zone of transition, you know, in between Europe and Asia. And maybe you know this idea of Gumilev, of Eurasian issue. It's Kazakhstan and Central Asia in common. It's the zone of interaction in between Europe and, let's say, East or Asia. And of course, the influence is very strong, and first teachers came from so-called Russia or European part of Russian Empire. But as regarding the names, you know, it was also kind of play with languages, because those names, even they are not Russian, Soviet forces, Soviet governmental structures, they tried to change the names of people in Russian way, let's say. So Kosteyev, he's Kazakh, but it sounds like a Russian end of the name and everything like that. So, and for instance, Korean diaspora, which we have a huge one in Central Asia, because they were replaced from Far East in 30s. So they also have, they changed their names and they lost their language because of this repressed power. But it's always like two parts of one coin, you know. You can find pluses and you can find a lot of minuses. And now, of course, we have these processes of decolonization and this desire to find national identity still. And now it's already a question how we understand this national identity. Government understand it in a very propagandistic way, and people and progressive artists, we understand it in the different way. So it's already without Russian Empire, but it's still like, you know, this kind of oscillation in between, let's say, good and bad. So, and about this so-called, again, Russian artists who are well known in Europe as Kazakhstani artists, for instance. It's because we are living there. We are not Russian, actually. We use Russian language. We looks like European, but we are not Russians, actually. So We have 130 nationalities in Kazakhstan. Everything is mixed. My partner is Korean. My kids partly Korean, partly Slavic. So it's like a big mixture. It's a kind of a big pot which cooking different cultures and different approaches and different styles of life. If I answer, I don't know.
Yes, thank you very much, Yuliya. Chabib and Dipti, can I ask you to briefly respond to the second question about cultural capital? We're running a bit late in terms of the Q&A, so I'd like to move on to the second session of our event after you two.
Okay, so maybe I will kind of firstly do simulation on how cultural capital like circulate around this kind of elites. Yeah, somehow like Siddhartha see as Sunario as a people, as students, and then see that Sunario is very talented, and then she choose him to help him as to make kind of artworks or aesthetic elements, helping him in Decenta. So this kind of situation is, I see, it's not a bit unhealthy for Indonesian art, because the circulation of capital is only focused on this kind of exclusive circles. So that's why the ideas of the different ideas or the dissenting ideas is prevented by this kind of situation. So that's why my argument is why dissenting ideas or critical ideas is not flourish in order. So like, yeah, I will answer. My answer is like that.
Thank you, Chabib. Dipti?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And that's an interesting sort of way to think about the site of the association itself, as well as having a certain kind of cultural flow and flow of various kinds of capital. Obviously, one thing that comes to mind in terms of cultural capital is that becoming a member of the association provides you with a cultural legitimacy within the purview of the nation as an artist, right? And it's really important to also know that there are obviously other modes of aesthetic production and practices already going on in Nepal. Like but they are often termed as either religious art, or people who practice various forms of art are called like artisans. So in a way, like becoming part of this sort of fine arts association gives them the legitimacy that is sanctioned by the monarch themselves, right? And it would be quite difficult to sort of delineate certain kind of relationships, because there are definitely some like filial ties through which people become part of this association, and some that are more generational. So people bring in like people from their like sort of younger generation, right? So there are sort of slightly more like complex ways in which the transfer of cultural capital is happening here. The other point is also the association definitely is a site for cultural capital to be like accessed, because once you're a member, you also get opportunities to participate in all kinds of international exhibitions. So you sort of you basically put together this entourage of artists who participate in things like Indian Triennial, or Asia, or the Bangladesh Biennial, right? So people were traveling as part of this sort of like association. So in a way, the association provides certain kind of cultural sanctions to these artists, but I'm sure that also limits, like Chabib was also hinting at, like certain kind of critical sort of like practices, which would be an entire different point, I suppose. So yeah, that's an interesting sort of way to think about the site, definitely. Yeah.
Thank you, Dipti. I'd like to
Thank you so
thank
much.
Dipti, Sherchan, Chabib, Hapsoro, Yuliya, Sorokina, and of course our special guest, Amanda Rath, for sharing your research with us today. I'd like to
Thank you so much.
I'd like to remind our audience that our third day of speakers will be tomorrow, and that set of panels will start at 8 a.m. Hong Kong time. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone and to wish you all a good day and to see you next time as we continue the symposium.
Thank you.
Thank you very
everybody. It was
much
so nice to meet
to
you.
all.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Take care.
everyone.